Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Our focus today will be on writing theoretical framework. This lecture is a continuation of our research methodology series that we take in the Department of Political Science and International Studies, Ahmadu Bello University's area. It's a discussion that we usually have with postgraduate students of the department. Um, by way of introduction, we know that theoretical frameworks are actually essential in political science because they provide a structured foundation for research design, they guide analysis and interpretation by ensuring a clarity and depth in scholarly work on complex political phenomena. And we certainly understand that theoretical framework refers to the set of ideas, concepts, and theories that provide an intellectual foundation for a research study. In political science and international studies, we know that this theoretical framework actually helps scholars make sense of complex political realities such as power, governance, conflict, institutions, and behavior. So, without a theoretical framework, our research will actually become quite descriptive rather than analytical. So, that's the reason why theoretical framework is often emphasized in research for a well informed analysis in the Department of Political Science. What role does a theoretical framework play in our researches? So we know that this theoretical framework actually plays a central role in shaping the entire research process. And of course, it determines what the researcher considers important and how variables, of course, are defined and how findings are interpreted. It, of course, ensures the study has a clear direction, coherence, and then scholarly rigor by ensuring conceptual clarity. Of course, it prevents logical gaps or inconsistency we often find in our researches. It, of course, helps identify variables and relationships, provides a basis for argument, and, of course, it strengthens the researcher's credibility because the narrative of or analysis has been situated within a particular theoretical framework, and it helps organize the literature review that we conduct before getting into the main writing, and then of course it guides the development of hypotheses and model diagrams where available. Now, the very big question we ask is how theoretical frameworks strengthen our scholarly work that we embark. Now, we can see that a very strong theoretical framework has a capacity now to ensure conceptual clarity without any ambiguity. It also prevents a logical inconsistency. It also helps identify variables and their relationships. It also strengthens the argument we set to offer, and it, of course, enhances academic credibility. For instance, in the researches we conduct, we usually adopt different theories. In a study of electoral violence in Nigeria, for example, we can say that a theory helps clarify whether violence is caused by weak institution when we are using, for example, institutional theory. We can also say that violence is caused by elite manipulation when we are using elite theory to offer our explanation. We can also say that this violence is actually caused by economic frustration when we are using relative deprivation theory. Now, how do we design a theoretical framework? Designing a theoretical framework is actually a deliberate intellectual exercise because it requires identifying appropriate theories, defining concepts, and ensuring consistency with the research objectives the researcher set actually to achieve. For example, a research project on youth employment and political instability may or can draw from relative deprivation theory or political economy theory to explain frustration and protest. So these are actually some of the things we consider when designing a theoretical framework for a particular study we are conducting. Of course, we will come to see that one in the subsequent explanation. Now, the first thing we do when designing our theoretical framework is we first identify theories for the questions we set to answer. Not all theories are relevant to every study. Theories, of course, must be carefully selected based on number one, the research problem, number two, the research questions, and number three, the scope of the research and the objectives the research set to achieve. For example, using realism to study local government corruption will actually be quite inappropriate because the areas are quite different. Instead, one can decide to adopt a public choice theory or governance theory, which will be more suitable in addressing the local government issues in Nigeria, for example. After identification of the relevant theories, we now go to the point of mapping key concepts and theories. Here, mapping theory and key concepts and theories involve showing how key concepts, of course, relate to one another within the framework we are working with. So this helps avoid confusion and then strengthen analytical coherence. For example, in governance studies, we can see that governance deficit, of course, is caused by a weak institution. Weak institution led to rise in informal actors, and then informal actors also led to erosion of state authority. So you can now see the logical chain, of course, that must be made quite explicit in terms of our analysis. After the concept and theories mapping, then we now move to the point of integrating theories and then end up with identifying the gaps. Sometimes we know that a single theory is quite insufficient in terms in some researches, but of course integrating multiple theories enhances explanatory power, but gaps must be acknowledged at this point such that you state the reason, of course, why the first theory is unable to provide answers or explanation to the item or issue you set to investigate. Then you complement it with another theory that has the capacity now to provide explanation to the other part that the first theory is missing. So combining institutional theory, for example, now with informal economy theory, can actually explain both the failure of the state and then the adaptive strategies of non-state actors who have actually come in now to fill in some gaps left by the governance deficit or the state's role in terms of providing solutions to the problems bedeviling the sectors or societies. Now, how do we write and apply theoretical frameworks in our studies? This is one issue also that is sometimes students find it quite difficult to do. When you go through different researches, you realize that some students will only end up by in explaining the theory, the history of the theory, the assumption of the theory, the strength of the theory, the weakness of the theory. They even create a section where they mention relevance of the theory to this research. But when you go to the section that talks about the relevance, you realize that it's quite very shallow. It's not really talking about or providing the relevance. At the point of relevance, there are some issues that you need to identify or that you need to show to your readers. You try and establish connection. You show how that theory leads to the emergence of that particular behavior that you want to address. For instance, let's talk about the structure of theoretical framework. A well-written theoretical framework section should actually define key concepts. Number two, explain selected theories. And then number three, be able to show theories, how theories all relate to the research problem. Say, for example, we are not talking about, let's take the example of governance deficit and then the emergence of non-state actors. We can say that there is a chapter now talking about theoretical framework, in most instances under literature review. So we now move from defining the governance as we know, we started, then move to the level of explaining governance deficit theory, and then we try as much as we can to establish the emergence and link between the deficit governance and then the emergence of informal power structure. This is what we do. Sometimes this issue of history, assumptions, and what have you of the theoretical framework can actually be conducted in just three, four, at most five paragraphs. But the real part, you have to go to the level of practicalizing what it is. The behavior that you want to investigate, we expect you now to extract it from the theory so that we can see a synergy between the assumption of the theory and the practical reality you set to investigate. That's the essence of conducting a literature review and theoretical review as well before even embarking on writing the theoretical framework. So you have to get it right such that if your examiner goes through your theoretical framework, I tell you, if that is really a very good theoretical framework, your examiner will be able to identify. In fact, he can even predict your findings from theoretical frameworks because you clearly demonstrate what that relationship means. So, still at this point of applying the theory in data analysis, we can say that effective application of theoretical frameworks can actually enhance the accuracy of our data analysis. By systematically applying theory, researchers can then be able to interpret political behavior data more meaningfully, which will lead to robust conclusion and insight. So, what that means is we know that the theory actually guides how data is interpreted, not just how it is collected. The two, of course, go together, and that it provides meanings to patterns and trends. Say, for example, in interview responses that researchers, of course, are conducting, we say that for you said to conduct a research, for instance, on informal governance that we are talking about. So you conducted an interview, and then in the process of conducting interview, you came across a set of transporters or transport workers who are actually part of your respondents that you identified. So they can that data, the responses from the transport workers can actually be interpreted through informal governance theory now, because that will explain why those organizations, informal institutions or non-state actors have actually emerged, and then the level of authority they actually will or command uh, in the transportation sector. Sometimes, for easy design of a theoretical framework, I usually suggest that students should actually develop a habit of designing a flow chart for the research guidance or even the writing the theoretical framework, because this flow chart usually demonstrate how theory informs each stage of research from problem identification to conclusion. So in the case of designing literature and theoretical framework, we can say, for example, that you can say governance deficit, you can see it, which is actually part of the informal authority governance. And of course, that leads to the institutional failure. And the institutional failure leads to emergence of informal actors, and then that leads to the policy implications we are talking about. So this helps students maintain logical flow of their analysis. It usually starts from one point then to the other. So if you have it now designed in a flow format, then you can actually from there be able to identify, see the logical coherence, the logical flow, and that will help you in designing a better theoretical framework, and then ultimately provide a well coherent analysis. So, in conclusion, we say that understanding the design, writing, and application of theoretical framework is crucial for political science researchers, because that ensures clarity and coherence in scholarly work while highlighting critical differences with conceptual frameworks, because there is, of course, that relationship or differences between theoretical framework and conceptual framework. We'll come to discuss that one in our next discussion. Thank you for listening to me. Where you have any question to ask, then we can meet in class in our next class, and then discuss it.